What's up, students and friends? This is Mr. McDonald here with a quick lesson for you on Bible translations. So hang with me, make sure you're taking notes. If you're in my class, and we're going to talk about why are there so many Bible translations. I'm sure that you've probably had a conversation with somebody who said there's many translations of the Bible or there's many interpretations to the Bible. And there are many translations to the Bible. Unfortunately, there's many interpretations too. As you know, there is only one correct interpretation, and that is the interpretation which captures the meaning of the original author of any text. However, we are going to discuss how we get so many different versions and why that's not really a bad thing. If you look at this first slide, you can see represented you have King James, Revised Standard Version, Living Bible, New King James, the Message Bible, and the NIV over here on the right. So, to explain this, I just want to share with you three important factors. There's more factors, but these are probably the three most prominent as to why we have so many different variations of the Bible. So, hang with me and learn with me, if you will. So, the first thing that you have to understand is that the Bible is static, but spoken language changes. So, once something's written down, it stays the same, but the languages, if you're translating something, the languages, the spoken languages, are always changing. It might be a slow change, it could be a fast change, but they are definitely always changing because any spoken language is an active language. Any language still in use will change over time. You add new words, you invent new words when new things are invented, old words fall out of use, words even evolve in meaning. We've talked about that in class. Um, for instance, with the Passion of the Christ, today, passion might mean having an intense feeling, but at the language that is used, the older language for the Passion of the Christ, what it meant was to be um, to suffer. So the suffering of the Christ makes a little bit more sense for that movie. So English has changed, and the earliest versions of the Bible in English are 500 or so years old. The most famous one is the King James, which is 400 years old. But you have to know English has changed quite a bit in 400 years. 400 years ago was the time of Shakespeare. And if you've read Shakespeare, you'll note that it sounds a little different than English. Or current English, I should say, or contemporary English. You can understand it, but you have to do some work and some study and to really understand the meaning as it's supposed to be. So the more you read Shakespeare, the more you read older texts, the easier it will be to understand. It's just kind of like a little bit of acquisition. So today's English is not the same as English 400 years ago. Now, 600 years ago, English was even more different. You go a couple more centuries back from the King James, and you would not even be able to understand the words that are being said. You might be able to pick one out here or there, but it's very different. That's a era called Middle English, whereas Shakespearean language is kind of like what they would call early modern English. And English has changed quite a bit. I have this video I want to show you guys, just to give you a sense of how it's changed. So listen to this. This is English, Middle English. This is from the Canterbury Tales, and this is what it would sound like if you were reading it.
Juan that April with his sure sword, the drought of March, hath pierced to the road, and bathed every vine in sweet liquor, of which virtue engendered is the flower.
Okay, that's English. It's called Middle English. Now, you might have been able to pick out a few words there, but you definitely did not understand what that person was saying, even though it is still English. That's how much language changes over time. 1,000 years ago or a millennia ago, you would definitely not be able to understand the English. That's Old English. If you want to read or hear a text in Old English, listen to Beowulf in original Old English, and you won't be able to understand any of it. It sounds more like German. Anyways, the Bible is static, it doesn't change. We know we have it in the original languages, fairly certainly. But when you write from that language to our contemporary languages, you um, have to note that it changes over time. So even 50 years ago, when the Bible was translated to English, our English has slightly changed. And so that means that we constantly need new, very scrupulous translations by scholars. So scholars have to get in there and say, okay, it's changed, the language has changed over time. And so we're going to have to update our translation of the Bible to follow how language works. Otherwise, as language changes, you're going to be stuck with older versions and you're not going to be able to get the meaning out as easily. So that's the first reason. The first reason is essentially in translation. Why we have different versions is because language changes and that necessitates a more modern version. Okay, second thing, well, let me show you how this works actually before we go to the second thing. You can kind of see how easy it is for language to change in 400 years. You listen to some, but let's read some. So, King James Version in 1611 was when that was published. Uh, the English Standard Version was published in 2008. Just look at these two verses. Matthew 12:1. At that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were an hungered and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. There's a few things that don't make sense in our contemporary understanding. Number one, there was no corn in the Middle East, but the word corn meant wheat at the time that this was translated. It makes more sense that Jesus was picking heads and grains of wheat, and his disciples were eating them. Have you noticed it says they were and hungered? That's how you would say that back then, as opposed to today. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath. His disciples were hungry, and they began to pluck heads of grain and to eat. Much more contemporary, as you can imagine. So you got your little line here, and you'll as time progresses, you need to update your versions. There's nothing wrong with it. It's part of it. Okay, second thing. This is a little more controversial. Older manuscripts are discovered and applied. As scholarship increases and archaeologists discover older and older manuscripts, new translations are merited to maintain Christian and academic integrity. So you can imagine as technology increases, as information is much more easily transported from across the world, we get more data about older manuscripts of the Bible. And with that being said, in order to be honest academically, what we need to do is literally use those in our modern translations. Um, if you don't, you run the risk of being dishonest in a sense. You know, if you find an older version that's closer to the source, there's quite a bit of force to the argument that that's probably more correct than a manuscript that you found later because of typo errors and transmission errors. So at the time that King James was written, you had very recent manuscripts that were handed down by kind of a tradition. Nowadays, with more contemporary translations, we have older manuscripts and a lot more manuscripts. So most modern translations use older and more diverse manuscripts than that of the King James Version and earlier translations. There are debates, though, about the validity of using older manuscripts. Nothing here that we're talking about is not under debate. However, that debate is beyond the scope of this lesson. I did do an extra credit on why the particular verses are missing from the NIV and things like that. If you guys want to check out that extra credit, it is up on Google Class. So that's the second reason, is that we've found other sources that we need to use to make sure that we're being 100% academically honest with translating the Bible. And we've talked about that in class as well. Third reason is simply due to the nature of translating from one language to another, you are going to have variants. So each human language is unique. If you learn a second language, you'll note that there is no one-to-one match between the two languages. They are different. Their syntax is different. That's the order of their sentences. Sometimes there's words in one language that you really can't translate very well into your language. It's just a concept that works in that culture. My second language is Portuguese, and there's several words, hundreds and hundreds of words that don't translate very well over into English. You just have to know that that's how it is between translations. So if you're taking one language and bringing it over to another, you really got to struggle over what words should I use to convey this meaning. And between two people, they might use different words. And there you have a variation, right? So the art of translating can create slightly different versions since translators have to wrestle with which words or phrases best convey the true meaning of the original text. So you kind of see in this graph here, you have the author's meaning on the source text, and the translator, the scholars, work really hard to understand the meaning. That's what they do with their life. And then phase two, though, is bringing from the meaning that they have into the next language, which is the receptor language. This is the what the goal is to get the same meaning across here in the most honest and understandable way. So translators must choose a balance in translating. So I want to teach you something. There's kind of two ways to go about the translation to reach equivalence. You might ask, what's equivalence? This right here, getting the same meaning between the two texts, is equivalence. You're trying to get those equal, right? So you have two ways of going about that equivalence. One is the dynamic equivalence right here on this side, and the other is a formal equivalent on this side. The dynamic equivalent means that the translator understands what the verse says, and they want to bring the whole meaning over to the new text. But because of syntax and phraseology and vocabulary between languages, they kind of have to interpret it for you and bring over a new sentence, right? They're trying to give you the dynamic, which means the same meaning as best and as simple as possible as the first text to the second text. But doing that sometimes can really change how it looks between the two. The other way, other theory, I mean, both of these, you have to use both of these, is the formal equivalence. Formal equivalence is like you're being more strict. You're not really trying to get the gist of what they're saying. You're more going word for word. You want to be as, or some people call this literal. You want to be as literal as possible. You get this word translated over, this word translated over. So the meaning, you're hoping the people still get the meaning on this side, but you're hoping that the meaning comes through their work. They have to actually do the work because it's not going to make as much sense as the dynamic. So the reader has to do the work of understanding in their mind. Let me show you how this works through two scriptures. So there's this famous passage, 1 Peter 1:13, where Peter just uses an interesting phrase. It's so I'll explain it as we read it. So 1 Peter 1:13 in the New Living Translation. So prepare your minds for action and exercise self-control. Put all your hope in the gracious salvation that will come to you when Jesus Christ is revealed to the world. So what the translator did is they read it in the Greek, they understood it, and they translated it in the NLV in a way that you could understand. But the problem is, so they got what the author was in trying, what they believed was the intent of the author over to you. But that's not exactly what it says in the formal sense. So go over to Young's literal translation. Young's literal translation is it's a little bit older, but basically they translated word for word. And because Greek is out of order from English, normally when you translate, you got to put it in order so it makes sense in English. Young's tried not to change the order from the Greek, so it's a little harder to follow, but it's very, very literal. So this is like word for word and very much the same kind of syntax. So here's what it means in Young's literal, or how it sounds in Young's literal. Wherefore, having girded up the loins of your mind, being sober, hope perfectly upon the grace that is being brought to you in the revelation of Jesus Christ. Okay, so obviously different. And you get this phrase, gird up the loins of your mind. And we've talked about this in class. Girding up your loins was something that the Hebrews did. So a little bit of cultural context because they wore tunics, which are like long sleeve shirts with skirts that go all the way down to your ankles. If you have to run or do some heavy work, you you like lift up the skirt and you tie it around your thighs. So they operate like shorts. And then you can run and fight or do whatever, build something without messing up your tunic or tripping over it. So you're girding it up. So if someone girds up their loins, it means they're going to do they're preparing to do some hard work. So if you're girding up the loins of your mind, that means you're preparing your mind to do some hard mental work. Okay, that's what it means in the dynamic. So you go over to the dynamic and it says, prepare your minds for action. That's really what the author meant to say. They just said it in a figurative sense. Gird up the loins of your mind. So you can see there's the literal or the formal equivalence, and then there's the dynamic, what the meaning kind of was translated in an easy way. Both are accurate translations, both are fine to read. However, one is more literal, one is more dynamic. Hopefully that makes sense. By understanding that, you got to know that there's going to be translations with different theories. Some translations go way on the dynamic equivalence, some go way on the formal equivalence. Some people will inevitably ask me, what's my preference? Well, when I was younger, I read from a more dynamic equivalence, or the NIV is what I read from, because that's what was around. And the NIV has a lot of dynamic equivalence in it. Now I read on the opposite end. I read from the formal equivalence, or the NASB, which is almost as far as you can go, not quite as far as Young's literal, because I know a lot of the cultural background and I don't need a translator to do the work for me. I know it myself, and I kind of want to know exactly how it looked. But sometimes I can't even rely on that, and I got to go back to the Greek and read it from the Greek. And that helps me in my Bible studies. So there's a slide here. You can kind of see um, the different versions that work. Let's see if I can do the slideshow for you. You can kind of see the different versions here. An interlinear, which basically means you're looking at the Greek. Here's NASB. This is what I read. This is the more literal scale. So this is inverse from what I showed you earlier. The word for word ones, NASB, ESV is over there. The King James is very much word for word. Now you have these ones that are kind of in the middle, where they do more of a thought for thought instead of word for word. So there's a little bit of dynamic equivalence. And what they try to do is make a balance. And here's your NIV right in the middle. And the NLT is over here, where it gets a little bit more dynamic equivalence. Now, then there's ones like the CEV. I'm a little uncomfortable over here. I think that's allowing somebody to interpret the Bible a little too much for you, and it's not really necessary. And then, of course, there's the Message, and I absolutely do not like the Message. Not necessarily because it's a paraphrase. I just, as an English major, I think that it does not sound natural, um, and I just don't like it. So that's on me. Anyways, you guys get the idea, and that's really the difference between them. But the last thing I want to say on this is this: there is really hard there not hard, but there's really great Christian work to be done in academia. We really need scholars that do this kind of work. There are really studious men and women of God who spend a lot of time working on translating Bible in English or into other languages through organizations like Wycliffe. They'll bring the Bible into other cultures that don't have a written Bible. There's people who find old manuscripts and do archaeology. These people are academic. They go to college, they go to universities, they go to graduate school, they become doctors in their fields. And some of them are pastors, some of them aren't. Some of them, it's like their contribution to the kingdom of God is to do these things that will take like your entire life, will take the dedication of a scholar to do, so that people like me, a pastor and a high school teacher, can use all the work that they did to build up my congregation and my students accurately and honestly and sincerely with trustworthy information. So there's nothing wrong with it. The only reason I say this is because we don't talk about it a lot in class. But if you find yourself gifted in academics, and pray about maybe if you're called to do something like that, and then we could talk about that later on in class. All right, my friends, it's been good. Hope that you took some notes, and make sure you complete your assignments, and I will see you on Tuesday. Have a great day.